talk about another fraction multiplication problem. This is the same one we did at the C&P. Let's say that in my garden I have 5 rows, and 1/4 of each row of my garden has squash planted. So that would be 1/4 of 5 rows. So 1/4 of the first row, 1/4 of the second row, etc. So as repeated addition, I would write that as 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4, or 1/4 times the 5 rows. Now, here's where we tend to teach kids a trick that gets them in trouble sometimes. We like to say, when you see of, it means multiply. And I want you to be really careful with that, because there's a lot of places I can use of in a sentence that has nothing to do with multiplication. So I'd much rather you build the understanding through manipulatives, drawing, tearing paper, talking about what's happening in the problem, than looking for keywords like of and hoping that means multiply. So be careful there. Let's look at solving this problem with manipulatives. So here are my 5 rows of my garden. In this row, 1/4 of my garden is planted with squash, but these are planted with something else. 1/4 of this row, squash, these are something else. 1/4 of this row, squash, the rest of this row, something else. 1/4 of this row, squash, 3/4 not squash. 1/4 of this row, squash, 3/4 not squash. So this part of my garden is squash. This part of my garden, not squash. Don't need this part, because that's not what the problem is about. The problem asks me how much of my garden is squash. Well, I can look and see that 5/4 are squash, but that's not a simplified answer. So if each of these represents 1/4, then it would take 4 of them to make a complete row. 4/4, 1 whole row, and 1/4 left over. So 1 and 1/4 of my garden is squash. So let's look at that with paper. So we did this together, same thing as we did in the other problem. I have 5 rows in my garden, and each of these pieces of paper represents a row. It's broken into fourths already, so I would have 5 kids come up to the front of my room. You're a row, here's a row for you, here's a row for you, for each kiddo. Now, what part of the row are you holding? What part of the row you are holding is squash. 1/4 of this row is squash. The rest of this is something else. 1/4 of this row is squash. The rest of this row, something else. 1/4 of this row is squash. The rest of this row, something else. Maybe peas, maybe carrots, maybe potatoes. Who knows? That's not what we're worried about. 1/4 of this row is squash. The other 3/4 is not. 1/4 of this row is squash. The other 3/4 is not. So when I get done, I have 5/4. Now I would ask my kids, how does that tell me the answer? I would need to put 4/4 together so they could hand 4/4 to one kiddo. So there's 4/4 that make 1 whole row, and then I still have 1 more fourth in my hand. So 1 full row and 1/4 of a next row. Now let's look at that on grid paper. So let's tilt this back down so you can see. So here are the rows of my garden on grid paper. So let's shade one section, 1/4 of each row, to be squash. And I'm using a different color for each row because I want kids to be able to recognize where those parts came from. So 1/4 of row 1, 1/4 of row 2, 1/4 of row 3, 1/4 of row 4, and 1/4 of row 5. That's all planted with squash. Now we're going to draw a row that I can combine each of these parts onto, so we can see what the answer is. So here's the 1/4 of the red row. Then I'm bringing over the blue part. Now the orange. Now the green. But I haven't put it all together yet, so I need another row so that I can bring the purple part over. And here's the 1/4 of the purple row. So I can see my answer is 1 whole row and 1/4 of the next row. Now let's look at the math part of it. So here we have our two equations that we wrote out. I know that when I add these fractions with common denominators, I just add the numerators up and then simplify. So that would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5/4. If you have kiddos that struggle with that, I would have them count this with you. 1/4, 2/4, 3/4, 4/4, 5/4, so that they're not thinking this is 5/20ths. May have to go back and build that understanding of why the denominator doesn't change, and the manipulatives that we used and the drawings that we used will help with that. So we know that's 5/4, but we also know that's not simplified. And like we've talked about in the other problems, kiddos from 4th grade would decompose this and take out 1 whole, which is 4/4, and have 1/4 left over. So they would be able to say this is 1 and 1/4. When I multiply this, I multiply numerator times numerator, denominator times denominator, and again, I simplify to 1 and 1/4. So my garden, 1 and 1/4 of the rows of my garden are squash.